Ladies and gentlemen, um, we are currently witnessing a severe structural fracture within our federal framework, a phenomenon not entirely novel in American history, but one that is unfolding with alarming velocity and intensity in Minnesota. If we look back to the 1960s or past civil disturbances, the golden rule for maintaining domestic order has always been the seamless coordination and mutual respect between local law enforcement and federal authorities. However, the situation in Minneapolis today is not merely an isolated shooting or a localized protest. It is symptomatic of a deep seated pathology in our national security apparatus where trust between levels of government has completely collapsed. When Governor Tim Walz is compelled to activate the National Guard not to repel a foreign adversary, but out of an abundance of caution regarding the actions of federal agencies, we must admit that our checks and balances are paralyzed. The incident where an ICE agent fatally shot Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old woman, on the streets of Minneapolis has become the spark, but the powder keg was stacked long ago by suspicion and short-sighted political calculus. We cannot view this as a random accident, but rather as a systemic failure in crisis management and law enforcement execution. The cold, hard truth is that we are facing a crisis of legitimacy and due process, where Minnesota officials and the Trump administration are openly warring in the media rather than resolving issues behind closed doors. The fact that the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension had to withdraw from the investigation into this fatal shooting because they were denied access to evidence is a dangerous signal that transparency has been sidelined for cover-ups or parochial protectionism. In the intelligence world, when you lose access to raw data and crime scene evidence, you are flying blind, and an administration that is blind to the actions of its own personnel is walking a tightrope. Governor Walz was correct in stating that Minnesota must be part of this investigation because no federal agency can operate effectively on state soil if it views the local government as an adversary rather than a partner. Statements from Washington, particularly from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, asserting that the state has no jurisdiction in this investigation, are not only strategically erroneous in winning hearts and minds, but are pouring gasoline on the fire, turning a criminal legal matter into a political power struggle where the ultimate victim is public safety. Drilling down into the tactical details of this incident, we see a chaotic picture filled with intelligence gaps that, if not handled with extreme care, will lead to catastrophe. The federal agent, Jonathan Ross, who fired on Miss Good, has been identified as someone who previously suffered physical and psychological trauma after being dragged 100 yards by a vehicle in a prior operation. This detail is crucial not to offer an excuse, but to understand the combat psychology of those holding weapons on our streets. When you deploy agents under high-stress men who have been previously assaulted into a hostile environment with a mandate for crowd control or immigration enforcement without local police support, you are manufacturing a formula for lethal engagement. The administration, including President Trump and Vice President Vance, moved quickly to frame the incident as self-defense, labeling contrary reports as propaganda. However, video analysis suggests the victim's vehicle appeared to be turning away when shots were fired, creating a direct contradiction between official narratives and observable reality. This contradiction is the death knell for public trust. When the vice president calls reporters agents of propaganda, he is attempting to control the narrative, but in the digital age, ground truth often has more endurance than any White House press release. Most dangerous of all is the decision to surge additional forces into this volatile theater. Documents indicate that at least 100 more federal agents are being deployed to Minnesota, including Customs and Border Protection officials pulled from Chicago and New Orleans. Applying military logic, inserting units trained for border security and interdiction into an urban environment to manage civil unrest is a misalignment of mission capabilities. These Border Patrol agents are not riot police. They lack deep training in community de-escalation, and their presence, often heavily armed, is interpreted by locals as an occupying force rather than a protective one. Mayor Jacob Fry used the term occupy to describe this, and while that may be political rhetoric, it reflects genuine community fear. We must also note the parallel event in Portland, Oregon, where Border Patrol agents also opened fire on 2 individuals in a vehicle-related incident. This indicates this is not an isolated breakdown in Minnesota, but a nationwide pattern of engagement, a strategy of using federal muscle to impose order that risks escalating violence and hardening civilian resistance. We cannot divorce this incident from the toxic political environment that currently envelops every security decision. The campaign dubbed Operation Metro Surge by the Department of Homeland Security has resulted in over 1,500 arrests in Minnesota, a statistically impressive figure that masks a community relations disaster. The focus on the Somali diaspora, a group the president has repeatedly targeted with derisive rhetoric, has created an atmosphere of siege and hostility. When a significant demographic feels they are the target of a systematic hunt based on ethnicity or origin, they cease cooperating with authorities, and that is when social order begins to disintegrate. The protests erupting are not solely about the death of Miss Good. They are the detonation of weeks of pent-up pressure. The use of tear gas to clear crowds outside federal buildings and the closure of public schools due to safety concerns are indicators that the situation has spiraled beyond standard administrative control. Governor Walz is attempting a delicate balancing act, maintaining order by placing the National Guard on active duty while simultaneously trying to soothe community grief by declaring a day of unity. However, calm is a luxury when parties are actively provoking one another. The Department of Justice and Attorney General Pam Bondi have issued stark warnings on social media about red lines threatening those who impede federal law enforcement. Meanwhile, local officials dismiss Washington's accounts as garbage and propaganda. When diplomatic language between levels of government is replaced by insults and public threats, we are witnessing the collapse of political culture. This paralysis affects not just the current case, but sets a malign precedent. If the state of Minnesota cannot access evidence to investigate a homicide on its own soil simply because the shooter wore a federal badge, the concept of state sovereignty is being severely challenged. This will lead to protracted legal battles and further erode public faith in the justice system. Citizens look on and see that the law does not appear to apply equally to everyone, and when faith in justice vanishes, street violence is the inevitable result. We see crowds of thousands gathering despite rain and tear gas, chanting the names of the fallen and linking their pain to past traumas like the death of George Floyd, creating a wave of resistance that no police force can extinguish with batons and ammunition alone. To triage this hemorrhage, we require a radical shift in mindset, moving from confrontation to risk management. The solution is not to send another 100 or 1,000 federal agents, as that is akin to throwing logs onto a blazing fire. The wisest course of action now, however politically difficult for the Trump administration, is to immediately establish a transparent, joint investigative mechanism involving both the FBI and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Transparency is not weakness, it is strength. If Agent Ross acted lawfully in self-defense, there is no reason to withhold evidence. The Department of Homeland Security's refusal to comment and the blockade on information only fuel conspiracy theories and rage. There must be a moratorium on high visibility immigration enforcement operations, the kind involving street level takedowns during this sensitive window to lower the social temperature. The priority now is the preservation of life and property, not meeting arrest quotas. The transfer of agents from Chicago and New Orleans to Minnesota must be reconsidered, or at the very least, they must operate under strict coordination protocols with local police to avoid lethal misunderstandings. The ultimate burden lies with those at the top. Governor Walz, Mayor Frey, and officials in Washington must understand they are playing a dangerous game with national security. Politicizing police and military forces is the shortest path to the decay of a democracy. The National Guard, though activated, should remain in a logistical and infrastructure protection role, strictly avoiding direct contact with protesters unless absolutely critical, as the sight of camouflage on city streets is psychologically inflammatory. For the public, the message must be clear and consistent. Violence is not the answer, but justice will be served. The cost of failure in handling this crisis will not be measured merely in votes during the next election, but in permanent scars on the community psyche, in deep social division, and tragically in the lives of citizens and law enforcement officers. We need cool heads to prevail over hot tempers and decisiveness based on reason rather than emotion or partisan calculation. That is the burden of power, and if no one shoulders it seriously, chaos will be the only victor on the streets of Minneapolis tonight. Looking over the horizon beyond the immediate incident in Minnesota, we must question the sustainability of campaigns like Operation Metro Surge and the Department of Homeland Security's current modus operandi nationwide. Concentrating massive resources to execute large-scale arrests may remove some criminals from the streets, but if the cost is the total alienation of immigrant communities and open warfare with local governments, it is a strategic failure. National security is not just hard borders or crime statistics, it is internal stability and social cohesion. When a large segment of the population, such as the Somali community in Minnesota or protesters in Portland, feels the federal government views them as the enemy, they retreat into the shadows, creating fertile ground for radicalization. Vice President Vance labeling the press as enemies or Secretary Noem dismissing state authority are manifestations of the arrogance of power, a malady common to administrations that believe they can impose their will through force. But history, our greatest teacher, has shown that no security force, no matter how heavily equipped, can indefinitely control a population that is angry and has lost faith. Finally, we must return to the human element. Behind the headlines, the statistics, and the political bickering are flesh and blood human beings bearing the consequences. It is the family of Renee Nicole Good facing irreparable loss. It is the residents of Minneapolis living in anxiety, unsure if their children can attend school safely. It is also the federal agents and local police placed in impossible situations, trapped between orders from above and the harsh reality of the street. A rule of law state cannot operate on fear or brute imposition. It requires consent, respect for procedure, and above all, truth. If Washington continues on its current trajectory, fueling the fire with inflammatory rhetoric and unilateral action, Minnesota will not be the only flashpoint. This fire threatens to spread, consuming the foundational pillars of social order we have worked so hard to build. Now is the time to halt, to take a step back, to view the strategic picture, and to act with the wisdom of adulthood, placing national interest above political ego. If not, we will witness further tragedy, and history will not forgive those who chose chaos over stability.